here. If you listen closely, you might hear a bit of a Wisconsin accent sneak out during my discussion. That's where I grew up in the Milwaukee area in Madison. And the reason we ended up in Heinsberg, Vermont is because of this gentleman in the front row, Don Miner, who many of you know is St. Albans native. And Helen had her first steps in the house where Don grew up, as did our daughter. And it's just a delight to be here. What I did after I got my degree in chemistry and business, I went to work for Amoco, and then, as John said, I retired from the industry in 2013. This, as advertised, this is a talk about energy. It's a talk about what it's used for, where it comes from, and what are the implications of all of us using it. It's mostly, I'll be talking about the global picture, although I will share a few slides talking about the U.S. and a few other places. And the talk that I have today, even though it doesn't say part 1 and part 2, you're going to notice that it's really in 2 parts. And the first part is what is going on in the world of energy. It's big, it's complex. Each country has its own system of government and regulation, so talk about that. And then part 2 is what are these global implications of so many people using so much energy, and what could any of us possibly do about it? Now, many of the slides are based on publicly available information, and in particular, since I ended up with BP as a result of the Amoco and BP merger, I'm using the BP statistical data because I'm familiar with it. It's free, it's publicly available, and it's updated every year. And they have, if you're interested in pursuing this, they have, in January, they do a forecast out 20 or 25 years in terms of what it's looked like going forward. And then in June, they published something that they've been doing for over 60 years, which is the statistical review of all forms of energy, carbon dioxide emissions, and some other stuff going back to 1965 to present. So if you want to get a look at that, that's where it is. It's not the only source of data. It's one I'm familiar with, but it correlates pretty well with what other institutions are doing. One thing I would ask is that if I'm showing a slide and it, for some reason, doesn't make sense, just ask me, and I'll try to explain it. Don't worry about the units of measure. Like any industry, the energy industry has different units, and it's confusing. But if you look at the trends and the percentages, you can get the big picture. Lastly, I'm not here to convince you about any particular point of view. What I'm really trying to do is try to give you some information to help make this global energy system less complex and less of a mystery. And I hope to leave about 15 or 20 minutes at the end for questions and comments of any sort before John has some closing remarks right before noon. So does that sound all right? Okay, I'll get started. Well, I might get started. Let me try this way. Okay, the first thing is, what's energy used for? And many of us are familiar with using it in our cars and planes and so on, and all that fits under the banner of transportation. Transportation takes about 20% of global energy, all forms of global energy, but mostly hydrocarbons. Buildings, in terms of the houses we live in and the commercial places where we work and shop, takes another 17%. So each of these is about 1/5 of global energy demand. The biggest use of energy is industrial production. And if you combine that with hydrocarbons that aren't combusted, but instead are used for chemicals and lubricants for our cars and the machinery and tar and asphalt, that's over 50%. Just over 50% of energy use is in those two categories. And when you look at what's used in the industry, I mean, iron and steel is a big user of energy as they bring the temperatures up to turn iron into steel. Commodity chemicals, the same thing. Refineries themselves require large amounts of energy. Cement, making simple thing as cement, requires a lot of energy, and manufacturing and so on. You could call this by its individual details, or you could call it the stuff we buy and use. About 50% of energy requirements. When I started working back in the mid-70s, the global energy priorities were pretty clearly in shape, and they had been emerging since the 1960s, coming out of the Cold War. In the 70s, we had the oil embargo. We were worried about acid rain as a country. We were looking at Superfund sites, 3 Mile Island, and except for just a few that weren't born during that time. I think you recall some of those headlines. And so there were 3 big priorities about energy. One was energy security. Where are we going to get our energy if you could be embargoed by the Arabs and not be able to get gasoline, instead have to stand in gasoline? Energy affordability. The price of gasoline spiked during that time period. It got very high. And also, people were worried about making sure that there were acceptable environmental impacts from our energy use. So we were talking about acid rain or spills or smog or whatever. Those priorities are still valid, and these 3 priorities are still impacting our thinking. Energy security, the cost and economic benefits and so on of energy, and the environmental impacts, mostly felt locally. What I'll do now is show how the world played out over that time period. Now, what you saw in that last slide, go back to 65, we had about half the population that we have today. We had about 3-some billion. So this is just a plot of data showing energy production from the last 15 years. And what you can see, regardless if you can't read the colors, is that every one of those fuels, each color represents a different fuel, the demand for all of those fuels has been going up. So green is oil, and over this time period, oil has been growing in demand. Natural gas is red, it's been growing. Coal is this gray bar, it's been growing. And those are the 3 hydrocarbons that create CO2 emissions. And together, right now, that's about 85% of global energy consumption, or those 3 combined. What you can see in terms of energy sources that don't produce CO2 is you've got nuclear energy here in the light orange. In this blue is hydro energy, dams and hydroelectric dams. And this little sliver here, but getting slowly bigger, is renewable energy, mostly wind and solar, but other sources of renewable. And that's what's been going on. What is causing this? Basically 2 things. Rising populations. So as I said, the population is more or less doubled since 1965, and growing economies. There are less poor people, and as they get more wealth, they want to have more transportation, they want to have a different form of housing, and they want to fill their homes with more, I'll use the shorthand, stuff. Washing machines, dryers, lights, basic things like that. But that all adds up to a pretty high energy demand. Now here's electricity, and the amount of energy that is delivered to us in the form of electricity, as opposed to have the gas pump, for example, is about 40%, and that number is growing. So more and more of our energy that we're consuming on the globe is becoming electricity as the source, and we just plug in and go. When you look at this, something that's interesting is that the percentage of coal used in electricity has been pretty steady over the last 15 years at about 40%. And you would think, well, with all the renewables that we're putting in, wind and solar, that should be changing, shouldn't it? Well, here's renewables coming, and they are rising. So they're coming up almost to 10% of global energy demand. But, and a good thing, oil in green is declining. And that's a good thing because we really don't need to be putting oil into our power plants. But also, hydro right here, as a percentage of electricity generation is falling, and nuclear as a percentage of electricity generation is slightly falling. And renewables just can't be built fast enough to make up for it, and so the difference after some additional gas, is that coal is staying at about 40%, or has for the last 15 years. Something to think about. All right, this is a forecast. So like any forecast, it's going to have things that they didn't factor into the forecast and things that they put into the forecast that aren't going to happen. But it's a general outlook, and it goes back now to 1965 and looks forward 20 years. And what you can see is, now here the colors represent different parts of the world. So OECD, many of you will know, is a group of developed economies, US, Canada, Japan, Western Europe, and so on. And you can see that what's projected, and this is pretty standard over most projections, that the demand for energy in the developed countries is more or less flat going forward over the next 20 years. Not going up very much. A couple of reasons for that: the continued implementation of efficiency. We own all the cars we kind of need. And also our economies are shifting. We're not doing as much heavy manufacturing in the developed countries, and more service economies, which take less energy. So that's flat. And essentially all the growth is in China, in India, other parts of Asia, Africa, and other parts of the world, what I'll call the developing countries, or nearly developed countries. And that's where the growth in energy demand is projected to come from over the next 20 years. Here's a look at the fuel mix. So this graph shows the same thing we looked at earlier, which is that all fuels look like they're going to continue to rise: oil, natural gas, coal, hydro, nuclear, and renewables. You can see renewables becoming more prominent over the next 20 years. But when you look at the market share, in other words, what percentage of total energy, a rising amount of total energy, is made up of renewables, it's just still sneaking up to 10%. You can see that nuclear and hydro really aren't growing much. Oil is coming down and has been coming down since the Arab oil embargo. People have found ways not to use oil, but it's still a prominent source of fuel. And the projection is that 20 years from now, unless something pretty radical changes, we're still going to be using about 80% of our fuel mix as hydrocarbons. In other words, oil, coal, and natural gas, which provide 85% of our energy today, will be at about 80% in 20 years, unless something changes. BP also provides a look at the forecast of global emissions. So what is likely to happen is that the rate of CO2 emissions, carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas, that the rate of CO2 emissions is likely to slow down. It's not likely to go up as fast. And there are a couple of reasons for it. Economies aren't going to grow as fast. Economies will have less manufacturing and more service economy, which requires less energy. And there'll be a change in the fuel mix: less coal, less oil, more renewables. And so the rate of growth is likely to slow down, but not flatten out over the next 30 years. Again, unless something changes. And if you're familiar with the notion of 2 degrees Celsius of global warming, and I'll say a little bit more about that right now, that as people have looked at it in the climate group, they have said that we should be trying to, in fact, the Paris Agreement that we signed said that we should try to see if we can hold the growth in global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, or about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit, to what prevailed in the mid-1800s. We are not on that path. And the UN group, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, put out a report last week which sort of re-emphasized that point. The black line represents where it seems like we're headed if, things don't change. and the red line is what would need to happen to go to a path of 2 degrees. I looked at the data in terms of global emissions in 2017, it was in the BP report. And if you just look at the emissions from using and burning hydrocarbons for energy, it's a huge number. It's 33 gigatons, or 33,400 some million tons of carbon dioxide. And that is 11% higher than the emission rate in 2007. And then I looked at individual countries, and of course it's all over the map. China is, because of its large use of coal, is the world's biggest emitter of carbon dioxide, and that's up 28% since over the last 10 years. The U.S. is second. The U.S. is actually down about 13% in terms of carbon dioxide emissions over the last 10 years, and that's primarily a shift to natural gas from coal in this country, partial shift, and more use of renewables. You can see India is number 3, and they have gone up by a factor of almost over 70%. Other countries, Russia, Japan, Germany is number 6. If you added up all 9 of these carbon dioxide emitters together, they constitute 2/3 of the total global emissions, and all the rest of the countries, admittedly some small ones, but all the rest of the countries are responsible for the other 1/3. I mentioned the report that came out from the UN group on climate change, and I tracked the economists, and they had a little chart, and I was able to get that and put it on a slide. So what this shows, very similar to what I showed from the BP slide, is here's from 2010, the path we've been on, and if nothing changes, it's still going to rise. You can see the numbers are different. Instead of sort of being in the 35 range, they're higher, and that's because it includes all forms of carbon dioxide emission, plus all greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide, and they have a way of treating them as equivalent tons of CO2. We can get into the details if you want. But we're at about, call it 50 gigatons of CO2 equivalent, and it looks like, unless something changes, we're on a trajectory towards 60 until 1930. Here is the pathway for 2 degrees on the same basis that we looked at before. We're not on it. They talk, most of their report talks about what do we have to do to hold the increase to 1.5 degrees, or even farther from that. And this line here is about what it would take to hold it at 3 degrees. And what that line is it's the collection of what you call the promises, or the actual term is nationally determined contributions that each country said they would do in the Paris Climate Agreement a few years ago. So people recognized at the time, when John Kerry was Secretary of State, he said it's not enough, but it's a start. But this was, the starting point, and then the idea was that once people figured out how to do that, then they'd work on the next targets, a little bit like lifting weights, maybe a lot like lifting weights. So this gets us to the basic question of what are the energy priorities for this century, and I think the 3 that we've been dealing with are still important. It's still important to think about energy security, and energy affordability, and acceptable local environmental impacts, and we hear that in the news all the time. Even with renewables, we hear about people concerned about the local impacts of, solar farms or wind towers and that sort of stuff. But there are 2 other things that we need to start learning about and focusing on, and one is decarbonization, which is to reduce the amount of CO2 that's going up as we use energy. And there are overly simplified 3 basic ways to go after it. One is more energy efficiency, so that we can get the same work, either in our cars or other machines done, washing machines, refrigerators, get the same work done for less energy. We can change out the fuels we use, so less coal, less oil, less natural gas, use other fuels more. And the other thing is consumption. We just decide, I don't need this. And that's, do I need to own a car? I know that kids that are my children's generation are starting to think, well, can I just rent a car if I need it? That's an example of changing consumption patterns. And the other thing is adaptation. So, it would be lovely to think that we could hold this, we'd all galvanize around the globe and hold the increase in carbon dioxide such that the temperature only went up 1.5 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial times. But we're not on that path. And so I think one of the things we need to start thinking about is, well, okay, if we have to deal with something that's different from that, how do we adapt? Humans have always adapted, but how do we learn to change, to cope with changing climates? The reason I use climates plural is that we talk about global climate change, but climate is experienced at the local level. I mean, our climate's different from the climate in California. It's a simple thing, but so each of us will have to deal with the impacts in our local climates. We're also going to have more people going out, particularly to 2050, and so we started thinking about, well, okay, we had 3 billion some in 1965, we had an energy system then, but how do we build an energy system that works for all of us in a world of 10 billion people? Sometimes when I get to this slide, and in fact I did a short mini version of this, and I was giving a presentation to some students, and I could look, and as soon as I got to that last slide, everybody was depressed and wanted to escape the room. So the question is, okay, we have to figure out what we can do, but what can we do? And I've been working with the former dean of the business school at Fordham University in New York City, David Gauci, on this question. And one of the things that he has helped to provide is a way of thinking about this complex energy system that exists in each of our communities. And basically it's systems analysis that made it easier. And okay, well, what are the things we think about? Well, we think about, well, what resources do we have? Because that's going to influence what a country does. And as you're going to see pretty quickly, China doesn't have much oil or gas. They've got a lot of coal. That influences what they do. We'll look at state policy. Clearly, state policy, and state is meant as federal government, but it can also be, local jurisdictions. What sort of policies and rules will they have? What's the market system that impacts this? What are societal institutions and conventions that we use to address these issues, and how far can science and technology go? And I'll touch on each of these as I go forward. Just briefly. So, one thing on the oil and gas business, I mentioned that the units are crazy. Well, some of the definitions are hard to understand as well. So, this is a graph of oil reserves, and oil reserves have been going up over the last 20 years. How can this possibly be? Oil reserves is an accounting definition which was created so that when companies put together their annual reports, their shareholders could say, well, how much oil do you really know you have? It is not how much oil is in the ground that could be produced. It's how many oil fields have been discovered and at least have a well in them such that they could be produced. So that's how this can grow as people get more technology and more things going on. You can see that almost half of the oil reserves are in the Middle East. And another large chunk are in, this is South and Central America, but that's really Venezuela has a bunch. And then we have a bunch in North America. And the former Soviet Union. So Russia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and so on have a large amount of oil. The supply of oil reserves that we already have is like a 50-year supply. And so I think there's some that would hope we would probably be solved because we would run out of oil. We've run out of the cheapest oil, but technology helps to bring the price down. So the idea that we're going to run out of oil probably isn't something that we can rely on. A similar story for natural gas. You can see that here, the Middle East has a lot of gas. and Middle East has a lot of gas, as does Russia and the other members of the Soviet Union. You can remember back in the Reagan era where the Europeans wanted to build a gas pipeline from Russia. They wanted to tap into this stuff. Here in Asia Pacific, they do have some gas, some in Indonesia, some in Australia that get shipped around and so on. And we have about a 50-year supply of natural gas globally. The story on coal reserves have come down some. Some countries have written off their reserves, but it's like a 130-year supply of coal at current consumption. And so we're not going to run out of coal anytime soon either. And you can see a large amount of coal in Asia Pacific. China, India, Australia, Indonesia are all big coal producers. We have a large amount of coal in this country as well, as does Russia. So that's the resource endowment. In terms of state policy, one of the mini lectures I do with him is with David Gauci at Fordham is the role of the state. And for many countries, the energy business, jobs, investment, tax revenue is a big part of their local economies. So governments think about that, but they also are thinking about, particularly today, about managing the evolving conditions and priorities, including dealing with this issue of CO2 going up in the atmosphere. And there are a wide variety of tools that you'll all be very familiar with, laws that get passed, regulations that come out of our various agencies, incentives to promote wind and solar, how are taxes handled, either tax credits or extra taxes, the granting of permits to actually build things like pipelines, supporting R&D for new technology, and permitting infrastructure and so on. So those are various aspects that a national government can play. And without being political, what we're seeing now is that some state governments are picking up the pace on their own policies in this area. In terms of the market systems vary quite a bit. And in terms of total energy consumption, I've looked at how much of it is hydrocarbons and how it's changed and so on. And the U.S. is about 84% hydrocarbon use, oil, natural gas, coal. China is about 86%, but very different makeup. You can see a huge amount of coal being used to power China's energy system, whereas more oil and natural gas. And China doesn't have much natural gas, so that's part of the reason for that difference. We each have about the same amount of renewables. China's building them. Hydro, you might recall the Three Gorges Dam in China. A lot of discussion about local environmental impacts and local communities, but it's 8% of their total. Hydro is about 8% of China's energy demand because they don't have oil and gas, and so that became a priority. Something else that I want to just look at without saying it's good or evil or in between. But the U.S. in 2017 consumed 16% of global energy with a population of about 4% of the global population. China was a little bit above their global population, 23% versus 18% of the global population. So one of the things that people are thinking about is, well, what about equitable distribution of energy? And that becomes very clear on this slide. Germany, despite all this work, which is good, and their 13% of their energy comes from renewables, but they're still at about 80% hydrocarbons. Sub-Saharan Africa is about 88% hydrocarbons. Germany is in between China and the U.S. in terms of the ratio of their energy consumption to their percentage of global population. Sub-Saharan Africa takes up about 2% of global energy with about 14% of global population. And one of the reasons for that is there's a lot of energy poverty in Africa. Only about 35% of the people have access to reliable electricity. So that's yet another angle on this question.
What would be energy poverty?
So the term energy poverty is that people don't have the money and they don't have the infrastructure provided to them to be able to have even basic electricity and basic access to gasoline. That's a shorthand way of describing it. That's basically, someone that hasn't chosen to be off the grid, they are off the grid and don't have other options. And so they're walking, women mostly, to get water, and so on. Thanks for the question. So these are sort of insights into some of the things we can do. One of the things here in Vermont that since we've been traveling up here for quite a while now, have a house here, is the commitment to land conservation. And Helen and I got involved in a project down in Heinsberg that worked on that, and it helps reduce sprawl, which reduces some transportation, helps protect habitats, and also preserving forests and farms. Land use, changing land use, deforestation, worldwide is a pretty significant source of CO2 emissions. It's about 6% of CO2 emissions. Not as much as energy, but part of the puzzle. In the US, forest land and urban trees are significant capturers or sinks of carbon dioxide. And so even if you cut them down and grow them back, I mean, you're just cycling at zero, but as as our areas reforest, that helps sequester carbon dioxide. And urban trees, because they're sitting there by themselves with no competition, no canopy to stop them growing, grow like mad and absorb disproportionate amounts of carbon dioxide. One of the things that David Gauci and I did was we got together and we created this thing called Forum 100, which is online, it's free, and it's we host something called a Business and Energy Talk every couple months, 30 minutes. We follow the TED Talk rules. We have a question and answer session. And we've had 5 so far, and I'll just share a couple of them. One is a group called Air Miners that is looking at how you could take carbon dioxide out of the air, out of thin air, and turn it into products that you can sell and use. There are a bunch of people working on it, and we've got that on our archives, and you can just log into that, not log in, go onto that, and see what those ideas are. Another really interesting idea is soft car. So many of you will recall Swatch, the Swiss watch, where they took out lots and lots of parts, cut the number of parts by a factor of 10. Soft car is the Swatch idea in a car. So they re-engineered the car to have much less parts, be much lighter. The chassis is built and arranged separately from the body of the car. The body of the car is made from resin made out of beet juice, out of beets. And it's a bit like getting your hair cut. If you're driving around in the blue one and you decided you wanted an orange one next week, you just drive it into the shop, come out half an hour later, they've taken off one chassis, put the other one back. If you get a dent, you get a new chassis, and they just melt down the old one and make another one in the mold. I'll save the rest of it for you to look at on the website if you want. But really interesting idea, and it's an electric car that has other aspects that make it more renewable. There's a group called Purified Fuel that is going to give the next talk on November 6th. And they've come up with a new fuel additive that's got a lot of oxygen in the additive, which not only makes the engines work more efficiently, but it also reduces the CO2 emissions because you get a more complete burning and you get less particulates coming out. I haven't seen it yet, I'm looking forward to it, but anyway, that's something to think about. Then there are other innovations in the works, and as I said, I read The Economist, so some of these I kind of keep tabs and stay encouraged by what people are doing. One of the things is the next generation of air conditioners. So if you think about the population that's rising in India and China and much of Africa, they're not going to need an oil burner to keep their house warm in December through March. What they are going to need is air conditioning, much as we've had in the South that help the South grow and so on to improve productivity. But if all of them buy the same old-fashioned air conditioners, that's going to take a ton of energy, and the current coolants that are used are also a greenhouse gas. So there's some work being done to make them work more efficiently and also use a different coolant so that you get a kind of a twofer out of that one. So that's something that's being looked at. Recycling is something that I suspect many people in the room do pretty faithfully. We do. We recycle our tin cans and so on. Well, if you want to make steel that doesn't require so much energy, the best way to do it is make it in an electric arc furnace out of old steel. Huge energy saver. And all these people got to have some place to live. People are talking about people living in urban centers. There's going to be steel in those buildings. What people are starting to think about, they didn't use the word Lego because they probably didn't have permission, but, well, wait a minute, if we're going to tear these down and recycle them in 30 or 40 or 50 years, why don't we pre-make these steel beams and so on in such a way that they come apart easily? Not when you don't want them to, not during an earthquake, but with the right process at the end when you're tearing down the building and want to recycle the steel. So I thought that was pretty darn interesting. People are looking at new forms of cement to try to use less CO2 emissions associated with that. Now be careful so that the building doesn't fall down during an earthquake. Historically, cheap grades of carbon have led to deaths in many parts of the world. Flood insurance market, we just saw the latest with Hurricane Michael. How long are houses along low-lying coastlines going to be insured with national insurance? How do you think about that? What does that do to the revenue base of those towns? We need to think about that. And then carbon footprints. So there are some people out there that if you want to get on the program, it's a bit like a Fitbit idea. Many people count their steps. What if you counted your carbon footprint? Okay, I ate this, that was meat today, it was whole grain yesterday, I drove this far, and what if you could get something that could help you understand, well, how much energy am I consuming? Because when you have that signal, then you kind of go, oh, well, I could change this out and make a difference as a person. And then lastly, and this is what I'd say a provisional title, maybe someday David, our third co-author, and I will finally put a book together on all of this. It'll be interesting. I'm not here to sell it. I'm not here to sell anything. And maybe it'll be called a energy system for 10 billion people. So with that, I'm glad to be here, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have. John.
What's the future of very small scale nuclear?
So the question is, what's the future of small-scale nuclear? I don't know the details of it, but I know people are working pretty hard to have small-scale nuclear, which is distributed, and it sometimes operates on different radioactive materials than just uranium. I think some are looking at thorium and so on. But the idea is to reduce the scale, get out of the old designs, get safer designs, and spread them around so that they can respond more to the local environment. Going back to the three basic energy priorities of the 21st century, after 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl and Fukushima, that a lot of people that don't want to see anything that has anything to do with nuclear energy, which I get. Nuclear energy is not producing CO2. And so if we're going to get on a pathway to reducing CO2 emissions, are we or are we not going to have some kind of nuclear energy, whether it's that kind, part of the equation? It's got to be answered. I don't have the answer.
Or something that's intrinsically safe.
Well, people are not going to want to live next door to a small nuclear reactor is not safe. Absolutely. There are a lot of things when people look at it, they go, well, I like that in concept, but not,
right there.
Yes?
So I started to think it's like not in my backyard thing, like hydropower. But people don't want dam People
Right.
don't want to see windmills wind towers because they're unsightly, they don't want to see solar. It's almost like, well, we don't see the hydrocarbon energy, that happens someplace else. And I think we have to change that mindset.
I think that's right. I think that, you said it. I can only agree with it. That if we're really thinking about what can we do to first flatten the amount of CO2, and then gradually bring it, not gradually, pretty rapidly bring it down, so that we don't face the worst part of rising temperatures, we have got to take another look at some of the things we say, well, all things equal, I really don't want that wind tower up on my hill. But all things aren't equal.
Right.
Yeah. Good question. Anybody else? Yes.
What do you think the impact of all the environmental rollbacks in our country, what will be the impact of what's currently happening with pushbacks, deregulation, more coal, etc.?
So I'm not a very good forecaster. I'm a pretty lousy bettor. I lose most of my bets, so I'm going to use that with a caveat. My wife knows. She bought the tutu that I had to run. But in any event, I think that there's a reset with this administration on environmental issues. There are some that thought the previous administration went too far too fast. That's a political question. I think that in terms of coal use in the United States, coal consumption in the United States, this is not a comment against the coal industry, but it's pretty hard for coal to compete with natural gas. And pretty hard for coal to hold up against natural gas and renewables simultaneously. So I think we will still probably, as a consumer, stay on a downward trend. As a producer of coal, and this happened last year, we may end up exporting more coal. That again, could be seen as a political issue. And exporting it to the countries that are importing it from, like China imports from Australia, Indonesia, and so on. And I suspect we're shipping coal to China. But I think that the way our government works, and through changes of administrations, you go a little bit this way, you go a little bit that way, you go a little bit this way. Some of these things I kind of shrug my shoulders about, some I scratch my head about. But we're not in an expansionary environmental regulatory movement. We're in a contractionary phase. But there's a limit to how far it can go, I think, if I make a prediction. And most of these things are not done by congressional laws. They're done by administrative decisions, which, as we're seeing, the next administration can come in and say, okay, we got a different plan. That's the best I can give you with that one. I don't know if that helped at all or not really. Not really. Well, we'll have to see. I think that's why I look at the statistical review and say, okay, there's all that rhetoric. What really happened? And what really happened is we consume less coal energy. Yes?
Your thoughts on fracking? Any thoughts on fracking? It certainly seems to get a very bad name amongst many environmentalists.
Sure. Yeah. So fracking is, the first thought is I wish they'd come up with a different name. But this was done out in the oil patch, and the rest is history. It's a relatively new big-scale phenomenon. Back in 2009, when, if some of you remember the Waxman-Markey bill on climate, it was going to be a cap-and-trade plan and passed through the House in Washington. And I had a chance to look at that. And the notion that we'd have excess reserves of natural gas was not on anybody's radar screen when that was written. 2 years later, I saw people in the White House, and they were trying to decide, is this for real? And the Obama administration made a judgment that they would try to regulate it such that you would, like one of the issues is methane emission during the production, whether it's the use of the water, and I can get into more details. But rather than block it or try to prohibit it, and particularly after the Great Recession, they said, let's work with this because it's a pathway to reducing the amount of coal we use. I think that's kind of how they thought of that. There are issues that need to be factored. One of the regulations rollbacks that I don't get is the one on use of what's called, well, basically reducing emissions when you're testing these wells. There is equipment that can be done to protect that. It costs a little money. Smaller companies don't want to spend the money for it, and they're getting their way back. So there's that. In terms of use of the wastewater and what do you do with it, you should not be dumping it in the river because you're taking stuff out of, it's got various things out of the ground. And there's stuff that did get dumped in the river in the middle of the night because some Yahoo was doing it. I've had Yahoos work in my house. So, there's always one out there you gotta watch out for. The one that's, in Oklahoma is grappling with are the subsidence or earthquakes associated with removing fluids from the earth. And they need to take a closer look at where the fault zones are and how they're going to dispose of this fluid. So I think under the right conditions it can be done. It is helping to reduce the use of coal. But like anything else in the world can be done in a slipshod way and shouldn't be done that way. I don't know if that helps or not. Yes?
There was a recent series on the amount of plastic that is showing up in the ocean and elsewhere. Is there any effort to recycle plastic in a positive way that would help the environment?
I think that's a live conversation. We watch PBS NewsHour, and Judy Woodruff is kind of bringing this out every week, which I think is great. There are several ways of getting after this. One is finding substitutes for plastics, so that we find something that actually, you go to the grocery store, do you want paper or non-biodegradable? That's not how it gets posed, paper or plastic. And even that plastic isn't supposed to go in your recycling. So can we get comfortable with a different kind of packaging? Buying less reduces the amount that gets used, and plastic shows up because it's got lots of applications. People are looking, like I said, with this soft power at using organic resins to make plastic or to augment the production of a plastic product so you don't need so much plastic. And then there's the recycling process itself, which now it's, again, part of what we're seeing, but there was an article about what's going up in, so we're down in Chittenden County, in the recycling district, and what an all-in-one recycling bin at your front door looks like when it gets onto the assembly line, where people are literally picking stuff out, and how effective can that be, and how pure does the material need to be, where does it go, and how does it work? I mean, I think that's a whole area that we could be working on the basic point of protecting one of the first three priorities, protecting the environmental impact of these products. It's not a climate change issue per se, although if you use less plastic, it probably doesn't take as much energy to make the other things. So that's, I think, one in front of us and kind of right in front of us. Yes?
Are plastic bags so much cheaper to make than the paper? Why don't the big stores just do away with plastic? And when we were kids, or when I was a kid, we always used paper bags. That seemed to get the groceries home just fine.
Yeah, somebody spilled a bottle of milk, it was going to go right through the bottom of the bag, and okay, don't spill your milk. That was not an argument in favor of plastic. Yeah, we have it. DC has put a 5-cent charge if you take a plastic bag from CVS. That's discouraged. 5 cents has discouraged a lot of plastic bags. But it is pretty cheap to make. Because once they set up the machinery, and I think a lot of it is made out of, things that come out of refineries and natural gas plants, and it gets made in large volume and shipped around. As opposed to all the things that require to be made a paper bag. And we could just say, hey, we want to go back to paper bags. But that's a decision that would have to be made. It could be made by a local community like was in DC or at some larger scale. Yes?
What about the use of geothermal energy? Is that something that can be done large scale?
So, I don't know about, well, so some places do, Iceland does, but they've got, they're kind of sitting on top of a volcano. That wasn't meant as a joke, they just do, and they are. California uses significant amount of geothermal energy because, again, they're sitting on the San Andreas Fault and can tap into that. But geothermal energy can be at a much smaller scale. And I mean, one I'm familiar with, we have a geothermal tool in our basement called a geothermal or a heat pump hot water heater. And it has the added advantage of dehumidifying our basement, which I didn't count on, but it's pretty good. And then there are, and I don't know anything other than just to tell you, I haven't even really Googled the details, but there are outdoor air heat pumps. So you don't, this doesn't involve drilling down 40 or 50 feet, which we have friends that have done that for their house. But sort of like a window air conditioner version of a heat pump that can operate and take heat out of the air and deliver that to your house. I don't know the details, but that's that takes electricity, but that's another way to do it. I don't know that. Okay.
Any further?
Yes.
Why is gasoline in just about every other foreign country about $10 a gallon? And we gas, it goes up to $4 a gallon here.
Two different questions. I'll answer the first. Well, I'll answer both of them actually. So in Europe, for example, not everywhere, some places gas is subsidized, although they're trying to get people to stop doing it to keep the populace happy. But in Europe, the price of gasoline is, on a gallon basis, certainly $6 to $8 a gallon, maybe 10. Huh?
Right in Canada, it's about that price.
Yeah, and that is government tax. So we have, I don't know what the number is, 18 cents or 20 cents of gasoline tax added to our fuel. We could add $6, $8 to it. That would have an impact on the kind of cars people drive and how the distance they drive. It would also have an impact on people's wallets with the cars they've got. And we kind of walk up to the line of raising gasoline prices or putting the price on carbon, what is described, and then we walk back from it because we aren't politically to the point where we want to do it. Vermont could do it, and then people would say, well, everybody's buying their gasoline in New Hampshire. So it's hard to get your arms around, but putting a price, putting the higher price on a product reduces demand, whatever it is, milk, shirts, gasoline. And that's a tool. It's in the toolbox. And we just haven't elected to grab that tool. And that's been going on since the 90s when Bill Clinton was president. And it was hammered pretty hard for something called the BTU tax. So it's something to think about. John, thank you very much.
Thank you, David.